contention is losing interest. Current national debt is reaching precarious levels. Read in light of the Business Insider writes, failure to address our long-term fiscal situation has increased the national debt to over $20 trillion, the highest in history. Following the Trump administration's newly passed tax bill, this number will only grow. Despite losing government revenue, however, Congress will continue running up the deficit. The New York Times reports, after embracing $1.5 trillion in debt by slashing taxes on corporations and wealthy families, Republican leaders in Congress pushed through a 2-year budget deal that will increase spending by nearly $400 billion. Indeed, the idea that conservatives are more fiscally responsible is a myth. Daniel Mitchell of CNS News finds, after looking at domestic spending over 8 presidencies and 50 years, that Republicans generally recorded much higher rates of domestic expenditures. The Daily Beast furthers, when Democrats are in office, Republicans complain about deficits and the debt, but magically forget about all of that once they take power. This is due to an inescapable structural problem, where almost all of the incentives lead to more spending. Defunding popular programs is politically difficult because the people who lose the most tend to pay the most attention. National debt has risen to the point where simple solutions will not cut it. Jean Sahadi of CNN explains, there is abundant evidence showing that taxes must be part of the debt reduction, however distasteful the GOP finds them. The looming debt problem is just too big, and reducing it by spending cuts alone would require draconian changes that would hurt the economy far more than a mix of spending and tax reform. Moreover, lawmakers trying to negotiate spending cuts this year alone were limited to a working range of between $10 billion and $61 billion. In the context of a $20 trillion check, this won't nearly be enough. Absent a comprehensive plan to reduce debt, government interest payments will skyrocket. Collins 18 of USA Today explains that interest payments on U.S. debt are projected to total $7 trillion over the next decade, and by 2026 will become the third largest category of the federal budget. Schwartz 18 of the New York Times contextualizes that interest payments will overtake Medicaid in 2020 and the Department of Defense budget in 2023. Tanos 18 of CNBC adds, since interest rates may soon increase to 5%, U.S. interest payments may consume 50% of all income tax revenue within 2 years. Problematically, this increase in mandatory spending constricts fiscal flexibility in times of economic downturn. Ghilarducci 18 of Forbes explains that high interest rate payments limit the amount the government can spend on fiscal stimuli during a recession. The Economist 18 adds that as debt grows, fiscal stimuli will become even more important to recovery in the case of a looming recession. Unfortunately, a financial crash is coming. Fortune explains economies follow cycles. At some point, economic activity reaches a temporal peak, then begins to contract until eventually it bottoms out and starts growing once more. All signs point to the fact that this is happening now. The Congressional Budget Office finds that this year, the economy has begun overheating in just this way, producing more than sustainable long-term potential. Inflation and interest rates are rising and will likely continue to do so. With all of those factors combining, we know we are the late cycle part of a catastrophic, massively unstable business cycle. The impact of ignoring our national debt is a global economic crisis. Any U.S. recession, regardless of its cause, spreads to the rest of the world. According to Friedman 17 of the Huffington Post, the U.S. is the world's largest importer and has been the engine stabilizing the international system. A recession would inevitably involve a drop in U.S. imports and outgoing investment, which destabilizes global economies that have become excessively reliant on exports and FDI. Thus, the World Bank 10 reports that the recession of 2008 pushed 64 million people around the world into poverty. The longer we wait, the more there are at risk. The St. Louis Fed found that for each year of recession over the past 33 years, it has taken about 4 years of expansion for the gap to return to its pre-recession level, and thus we affirm.
No, you just want to see it.
Okay. Everyone's ready? Sajai indicated that the U.S. federal government should prioritize reducing the debt over promoting economic growth, and we observe that according to Krugman of Princeton in 2015, there is no upward ceiling to U.S. debt, and in fact, the ceiling is raised once every 8 months. There are 3 reasons why. First, according to Gorby of Forbes in 2015, despite the ballooning deficit, investors will continue to loan America money because they know the U.S. can produce more dollars to meet its debt obligations if absolutely necessary. Second, America defaulting on its loans would cause global economic disaster, so neither investors nor foreign countries will hike up their interest rates. This is why Applebaum of the New York Times reports in 2017 the U.S. can always borrow more money to keep financing its debt. Third, Prasad of the IMF writes in 2014, because the dollar is used in international transactions, countries will always continue to lend America money as a way of obtaining dollars for themselves. because they can buy bonds in their own currency and receive dollars when they are paid back. With that in mind, our first contention is bailouts. Along with the Washington Post reports last month, the U.S. will likely enter a recession come 2020, the worst economic outlook since November 2008. In fact, written in the New York Post warned in 2018, if mishandled, this crisis could be worse than the Great Depression. During recessions, the government promotes economic growth with bailouts to failing businesses and struggling households. However, Elliott of the LMM reports in 2018, these bailouts also substantially increase our deficit. Thus, affirming the resolution and prioritizing reducing the federal debt over programs like bailouts to promote economic growth would leave the U.S. defenseless in the face of the next recession. In 2008, for example, because the bailout economically sustained banks, businesses, and households, Bloomberg, for instance, quantifies in 2015. Without the bailout, the recession would have lasted twice as long, growth would have been 10% lower, and unemployment would have increased by 6%, leaving 8.5 million more people unemployed. Haven of the University of Wisconsin explains this translates to a 7% increase in poverty. Historically, Coppola of Forbes reports in 2018 that Europe's prioritization of reducing the debt over growing the economy prevented critical government action during the 2008 recession, causing a decade-long economic slump with double-digit unemployment, throwing away an entire generation's future in the name of balanced budgets. Contention 2 is foreign aid. Foreign aid promotes economic growth but also contributes to our debt. Meaning in a role where we prioritize reducing our debt and promoting economic growth, foreign aid would be cut. Indeed, Gates explained in 2017, aid improves productivity and provides the capital needed to sustain growth. And as a result, Acevedo of the Chicago Policy Review quantifies in 2017 that a 1% increase in foreign aid increases the GDP of the recipient country by 0.3%. Importantly, the US GLC explained in 2016 that because foreign aid strengthens foreign economies, it creates new partners for the United States as well, thus bolstering the American economy in turn. In fact, of America's top 15 trading partners, 11 were former aid recipients. However, Amadeo of the Balance reports in 2018 that decreasing government spending is the only way to reduce the national debt, since increasing taxes is a death sentence for politicians' hopes of re-election. Unfortunately, foreign aid is first of a chopping block when budgets get cut for two reasons. First, Harris of the Oregon Project explained in 2018 the Trump administration's belief in America first sidelined the needs of other countries, which is why Trump already plans to cut foreign aid by 31% to reduce the deficit. Second, politicians must answer the will of the people for re-election, and Rampel of the Washington Post reported in 2017 that 46% of voters believe that foreign aid contributes a great deal to the national debt, whereas only 18% believe the same about social spending. Moreover, and that too is what The Atlantic explains in 2017, policymakers will always cut foreign aid first because American voters don't bear the direct consequences. Cutting foreign aid harms the world in two ways. First, since foreign aid sustains economic development, Albee of Western Michigan University found in 2011 that a 1 percentage point increase in aid decreases poverty by 1.8%. Second, CF of the Washington Post found in 2017 that food aid alone helps 1.3 million people each month escape starvation and keeps many developing countries from the brink of famine. Save these programs and the game. Are you ready for cross?
Yep.
Okay. Oh no. Okay. Do you mind if I take first question?
Go for it.
Can we take our ties off?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have to ask you a question.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay. What does prioritization mean?
What comes first?
Oh.
Like what comes first?
Okay, cool. Do you have a question?
Sure. So let's talk about your global crisis argument. There we go. All right. So when there's a global crisis, that is like a global economic crisis, does that affect the global poor?
Yeah, probably.
Why?
Why? Because the U.S. beats the imports. And these countries, developing nations, are primarily reliant on exports to the United
Are like
States.
subsistence farmers exporting their crops to the United States?
We're not talking about farmers, we're just talking about goods.
Well, I think the majority of the global poor do things like subsistence agriculture.
That's, okay, yeah, but a lot of that actually does get exported.
That's what
Well,
actually
not
no, they're
subsistence
subsistence
agriculture,
farmers. But like, are the global poor...
Fundamentally, the economies of developing nations is excessively reliant on exports. That's the freedom evidence we read here.
Okay, so let's talk about exports.
Yeah.
So things that developing countries make, are those exports, is the demand for those exports elastic or inelastic in the United States and other developing countries?
Some are elastic, some are inelastic.
So what kind of goods are developing countries making?
All kinds of goods.
So they're majority producing things like the stereotypical example would be like t-shirts in factories in Southeast Asia or other like low skill manufacturing things.
Right. So you're just talking about clothing specifically. So there's a lot of things that get manufactured in the developing world. For example, like things that contain like plastic in them. There's a lot of factories in the developing world who actually produce these elastic goods.
They're very simple, basic goods that people always need in developing countries. But for example, they're not making Swiss watches and things that people cut when their incomes decrease.
Yeah, those are probably in Switzerland. Yeah, sure there are elastic goods, that there are also manufacturing a lot of elasticity. But also the thing about inelasticity, it doesn't necessarily mean that like our trade with them is the same no matter what. It just means that it's like we're going to decrease it less so than the elasticity.
It does mean the trade is the same because demand for those goods is always the same in the United States.
No, that's not necessarily true. It just means that you have
if it's inelastic, that's what it means.
Okay. I have a question about your second contention on foreign aid.
Sure.
How much of our federal budget is spent on foreign aid?
Not that much.
Right. So then why would we cut it to reduce the debt?
So we give you two reasons. Firstly, because the current administration deprioritizes foreign aid funding, and second, because most people think that foreign aid is a bigger percentage of our budget than it actually is.
So, but does the government, do the people in charge know that it's not taking up that much?
Sure, but the people in charge want to be reelected.
So if you're talking about prioritizing reducing the national debt, if cutting from foreign aid is going to maybe reduce the reduce spending, or it takes up like 1% of our budget, right? So if it's only going to reduce the debt by that much, then how is it then in any way like prioritizing reducing the national debt?
So voters think that voters think it's a bigger proportion than it actually is, and second, the only world where budget cuts are actually forced is your world, because you have to prioritize reducing debt in your world, which means reducing the budget.
We'll take a little bit of breath. Observation, then an overview that I don't know. The overview, you can either flow on the app or the neg. It's kind of, you can float on ours. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. It's the most, all right. And then
is this a third piece of paper overview?
No, you can float on our case. I mean, if you want a third piece of paper, go ahead. It's kind of long. I'll let you get a third piece of paper.
Alright, we're good. Alright. Yeah, okay.
So, their observation overview their case.
Yeah.
Let's start on their observation. They say we can borrow forever. We agree, we can borrow forever. However, we are not going to do this for two reasons. First, we tell you that Democrats would call out Republicans for driving up the debt, and Republicans would call out Democrats for driving up the debt. So there are political costs of borrowing excessively because the other side can portray the party in control as fiscally irresponsible. And second, the U.S. won't borrow forever because investors will get scared the U.S. won't be able to pay everything back. Then they would demand higher interest rates or pivot their investment. The government doesn't want that to happen. That's why we're not going to borrow forever. Then all their warnings just say we are never going to default. If we continue to borrow forever, we are going to have to spend more on interest payments as they link into our case. If anything, that's good for us. Now, let's go to an overview. We specify in case that any reasonable solution to the debt problem must include tax increases. However, these increases will specifically take the form of a financial transaction tax, or FTT, which they tax on capital transactions to discourage excessive speculation. This is for three reasons. First is precedent. Bauman of Mother Jones finds proposals levying FTT as a way of raising revenue have already reached both the House and the Senate. Second is popularity. Glazer of the Wall Street Journal reports that the one thing that Republicans and Democrats can agree on is their dislike of Wall Street and major financial institutions. Third is a lack of alternatives. Trump's 2017 tax bill has already targeted corporate and income tax reductions. It is unlikely that in 2 years he would just increase them later. That's really hypocritical, so an FTT is more plausible. As such, affirming would discourage speculative spending and high-frequency trading. As Mitchell 14 corroborates, that every financial crisis since the 1630s can be attributed to mass speculation. Fortunately, Juan 17 finds that an FTT would curb speculation. He writes that major bubbles and crashes occurred in America because financial transaction taxes were historically too low. This is going to be important for on their first contention about bailouts. We say if recessions are more frequent, you're going to need more bailouts. That's really bad. And second, on their second contention about foreign aid, we find that first the FTT would increase revenue by $400 billion. This is super important, as Peterson 18 finds that a near 1.9% increase in tax revenue would keep the debt level at a level of 78% of GDP. That means you don't actually need these spending cuts they're talking about to reduce debt. And second, we tell you that foreign aid is going to get cut during recessions. Vox 11 analyzed the 2008 recession and found that the relationship between recession and aid cuts was linear. A bigger recession means a bigger cut. If we win that recessions become more severe and more frequent, we win their case. But now go to their first contention about bailouts. Realize they concede in First Crossfire that prioritization means that you're going to be reducing the debt first. If you reduce the debt right now, that means in times of recession in the near future, you're going to have more fiscal flexibility to spend on the bailouts right now. We say if you prioritize the debt right now, you're going to be able to prioritize economic growth in recessions. Second, we tell you that if we don't reduce right now, there are 2 reasons why it's going to stop these bailouts. First is political capital. We tell you that if the debt is really high, politicians are going to fear increasing it by a lot, thus they're going to spend less on stimuli. And second is capacity. If we spend more on interest payments, we just don't have the money to spend on fiscal stimuli. And third, realize it doesn't matter, it really doesn't matter, because Nickel 13 explains that in countries with high debt, the only way to finance increased stimulus is to borrow. This increased borrowing takes capital that would have been invested in productive assets like stocks, so he concludes that fiscal stimuli don't actually change economic growth. They can't access a recovery from a recession. Now go to the second contention about foreign aid. First, spending cuts aren't going to amount to anything meaningful. That's the Sahadi evidence from Case that explains spending cuts would lead to draconian harms to the economy. That's why they are capped at $10 billion to $61 billion. That isn't enough to really cause the impacts they are talking about. Second, we tell you we are going to link into their case better. The to-know evidence from Case finds that interest payments on the debt in the next decade will consume 50% of all tax revenue. The analysis is simple. If you reduce debt now, in the future, governments pay less interest and have more money to spend on the foreign aid programs that they tell you are so good. In the long term, affirming means that you're going to crowd out less, there are going to be less cuts. And then third, we tell you that you're going to de-link this because the U.S. barely spends on foreign aid. McBride explains that the U.S. only spends 1.2% of our budget on foreign aid. If the U.S. is trying to reduce our deficit, slashing foreign aid wouldn't do anything. Their case isn't really that topical. Thus, I urge you to affirm.
We'll run cut.
That was my third. Alright, is everyone ready? I'll be starting on our observation case. Go to our observation and case. They agree the United States can borrow basically whenever it feels like. They just say they won't because there's political pressure not to. Their own case admits that this political pressure not to has never worked before. That's why we have lots of debt. So obviously we still will take on debt regardless of this political pressure. Then they say that there's investor confidence issues when we take on more debt that will push up interest rates, and they say interest rates are problematic. The issue here is by conceding our argument that we can take as much debt as we want, we can take debt to pay back those interest payments. Forbes reports that the main way that we pay back our interest payments is by taking out more debt to pay back our interest payments, which means that if we can borrow as much as we want, we never have to worry about interest payments. Go to their argument, there is this third piece of paper overview thing about the FTT. A few responses as to why the FTT would be implemented. First, tax cuts are incredibly unpopular. Forbes explains that Obama, one of the most liberal presidents in history, even left 80% of Bush's tax cuts in place. In contrast, we know that spending cuts are not nearly as unpopular, given that Republicans basically campaign all the time on spending cuts. Therefore, we think spending cuts are a far more likely implementation of prioritizing the debt. Second of all, Warsaw Forbes explains that this FTT tax literally generates, quote, zero revenue. And the reason why is because if you increase this tax, you decrease investment at a corresponding ratio such that revenue does not increase. That means, A, there will still have to be budget cuts because this revenue from the tax won't cover our debt. But B, this is a very unlikely implementation of the resolution because it raises no revenue. Then they say that there's speculative investment because of the FTT. Two responses. First, we think that there are two types of investors. Those that always speculate and those that manage their investment on a day-to-day basis, and those that passively throw their money into a retirement fund. One kind always speculates, the other never does. That doesn't change. Second of all, the Financial Times reports that speculation is managed by supercomputers with complex algorithms who certainly are not going to change what they're doing by small percent changes in the FTT of all things. Go to our case on foreign aid. They say that foreign aid is going to. They say that we only need small cuts in the budget or whatever. First of all, this takes out their third response, because the third response is that foreign aid is a small portion of the budget. But if we need small cuts, it's very likely we cut from foreign aid, especially since we say that's the preference of American voters when it comes to making cuts. Then they say that it will consume 50% of our tax revenue through interest payments and we'll have to make cuts. But the fact that we can borrow as much as we want takes out that response too. That means that we gain clean access to cutting foreign aid if you vote for them, and that risks the lives of 1.3 million people every month that depend on that aid. So go to their case, 5 reasons we outweigh even if you buy every word of what they're saying. The first is that we think the global poor are the most important in the round because their poverty is the most severe. They don't have the same social safety net. And because each dollar of poverty alleviation can go further in the developing world because incomes are lower. Second of all, because recessions don't affect the global poor all that much because subsistence farmers are not trading on global markets and are fairly insulated from global recession. That's why Arias of the St. Louis Federal Reserve finds that it only took 1 year till 2009, after the 2008 recession, for developing countries to bounce back from the 2008 recession. And Mold of the OECD explains that our aid does not decrease during recession because we can always take out more debt when we need to finance our aid. In fact, Obama increased aid 2 times during the last recession. Thirdly, their arguments are all about decreasing the severity of investments, not about decreasing the severity of recessions, not about the frequency. The reason why that's important is because the first thing that happens when there's a recession is you pull your investment out of the developing world. That means the existence matters far more than the severity. Fourthly, given that the existence matters far more than the severity, given that the existence, when it comes to the global poor, matters far more to the severity, we think that we are the best side that solves for the severity. Personally, the Washington Post explains that we alleviate the severity of recession by lifting 31 million people out of the last one. Then we think that aid is just more targeted than general growth policies, because even if there's a recession, it certainly doesn't impact the parts of the developing countries that are poor.
Oh, yeah. My bad. All right. Yeah. So let's talk about this idea about why aid doesn't decrease in recessions. Why?
Because we can take on more debt.
Okay, but wait, hold on. Why would, if you're telling me that these programs are really unpopular and that when revenue decreases we want to cut them, then why do we think,
We're saying that when cuts have to be made, this is the first place that we'd make cuts. but we don't have to make cuts during a recession because we can borrow. That's why in the last recession, we approved a stimulus package, we increased welfare, and we increased
in the last recession, we entered it with a debt-to-GDP ratio of like 60%.
Yeah, sure.
If we enter a recession with a debt-to-GDP ratio with 110%, it's going to be a totally different scenario.
No, because we can still take on more debt, which is what we explained.
Okay.
The fact that the U.S. doesn't have to worry about its debt by virtue of the fact that it is A, the most stable economy in the world, B, that we have the reserve currency, which means that countries are always desperate to get their hands on U.S. financial assets. There's no way they ever stop buying debt.
Here's the problem with the analysis. You were saying that we are going to take out money to pay off interest. The problem is if we continue to take out more money, the sum of interest payments is going to be growing exponentially.
Take out more debt.
That means eventually there's just not going to be debt we can take out. That's why we pay off interest without taking up debt right now.
No,
that is really what happens. You're advocating for essentially like a Ponzi scheme.
No scenario where
this is a Ponzi scheme. That's why it doesn't happen. You can't just take other people's money to pay other people that just invest in you.
That's clear about what happens outside of the day world and what happens in the real world. Japan has a debt-to-GDP ratio of 230%, and their interest rates have barely budged. They haven't dealt with their debt problem. In the real world, our argument
let's talk about the difference with with Japan. Japanese investors, specifically, will only buy Japanese bonds. That is not the case with U.S. investors. U.S. investors tend to be foreign governments, or they tend to be people that would invest in other things. It's probably a false comparison. This is kind of off topic, but it's a false comparison.
Most of U.S. debt is held by Americans, not foreign governments. Second of all, we say foreign governments always need to buy American debt because we're the global reserve currency. They literally cannot stop buying American debt because global transactions are conducted in dollars. They need to get their hands on as many bonds as possible. There is literally no scenario, as you pointed out in your rebuttal, where we don't have the ability to take out more debt if we want to. You literally said that was before.
Yeah, but the problem is we won't have the political capital to do so.
All right, so let's talk about political
capital.
You keep telling me.
Wait, hold on. Let me talk about it. If I'm an investor, and I see if I buy a U.S. bond and they pay back my interest with money borrowed from someone else, and then that investor sees that they're paying back money with money that they borrowed from someone else, wouldn't I realize that there has to be an eventual end to this?
No, because there isn't an eventual end to this.
Why? Wait, it's not like an unlimited amount of money that we can borrow. It's just going to the more money that we borrow, the less money that there is elsewhere, dude. This is just like a terribly bad thing.
No, it's really not. So as you say yourself, we can take on debt whenever we feel like it. We give you 3 reasons in case, so I'll just repeat them if that's what you want me to do.
I mean, no, I'm just saying, if I'm an investor and I see that this is a Ponzi scheme, why wouldn't I freak out?
No, because it's not a Ponzi scheme, because they will always buy our debt.
That's the definition of a Ponzi scheme.
Sam, you laugh so loud. Jesus.
I'm going to start with, I'm going to start with the observation that they made.
Yeah, for the overview.
Yeah, I should worry about it. Start on their observation that we can simply borrow forever. The problem here is it's not really responsive to our idea that there's going to be political consequences because Democrats are going to say that Republicans aren't fiscally responsible and Republicans are going to say that Democrats aren't fiscally responsible. And they say that political pressure hasn't been working. However, it has because interest payments have been continuously taking up more and more of our federal budget. But then they also mishandle our response about the investors getting scared, and therefore the U.S. is never going to borrow forever, and we can't do that. It's literally a Ponzi scheme, and people are going to find out about it. But then let's go on to what's really crucial here. They can see the term that we read against them, which says that when debt increases, there's going to be more cuts in the long term, which means that we access these foreign aid cuts. But now let's go on to their way. They first say they talk about the global poor. However, one, we would say that we should affect all lives equally. But second of all, we also impact the developing world due to recessions. But second, they say that subsistence farmers don't trade with the United States. However, one, as time progresses, more of these developing countries are selling more industrial goods. And second of all, it's not responsible to be borne that during recessions, American investment in these foreign countries decreases. But third, they talk about how pulling out investment has to do with more the existence of recessions and not the severity of them. However, we would say that the longer the recession is, the longer the investment's going to be out of these countries. But then their fourth and fifth things talk about aid. However, aid won't actually account for the amount that recession is going to harm developing countries. Let's go on to our case and the overview about the FTT. They simply say that the FTT, they say that taxes are unpopular. However, we tell you that's the best alternative because income and corporate tax is not going to actually increase. But then they say that FTT generates revenue because it decreases investment. The problem here is investors are still going to invest because if they make $1.5 million with a 10% haircut instead of $1.5 million with no tax, Wall Street traders are still going to make massive profits. But then they talk about the status quo, however, it's not responsive. Every single transaction gets taxed, and that increases revenue. What's really crucial here is we impact recessions in two ways. First, on fiscal stimulus, because we tell you that debt is unsustainable, and Gil Arducci explained that interest payments limit the amount the government can spend on fiscal stimulus is the best way to get out of a recession. But second, on these financial transaction tests, we tell you that it's decreasing speculation and decreasing the frequency of recession. And Freeman tells you that a U.S. recession would drop imports and destroy global economies, and the World Bank explained that the 2008 recession drove 64 million people into poverty. We outweigh on time frame, because even if minimal amounts of foreign aid are cut right now to reduce debt, it's still a better alternative than letting the debt boil up so that you have much larger cuts in the future.
All right, we will keep running. Alright, cool. That was 110. We've used 240. We have a minute.
Okay. Just gonna go really quickly on their FTT stuff. Our case there. Is everyone ready? Oh. Alright. Everyone's ready now? Really quickly on this FTT argument, they dropped the evidence from Worcester that says that FTT generates absolutely zero revenue because even if a tax decreases, investments also decrease proportionally. They don't respond to this evidence. On our observation, there's two reasons why the U.S. can always borrow more debt. He just calls it a Ponzi scheme. If he thinks it's a Ponzi scheme, he shouldn't have conceded to the arguments and rebuttal. So first, Alam explains the U.S. can always keep borrowing more money because people can't let us default on our loans. Because if we default on our loans, the global economy just goes poof. But second, Prasad explains that since the dollar is the de facto currency of the world, everyone always wants more dollars. The best way to get dollars is to buy U.S. bonds, which is why everyone keeps buying U.S. bonds, and we can borrow indefinitely. The reason that's important is that it takes out their response to our aid argument where they say that debt increases over time. Even if debt increases over time, debt doesn't matter because we can just keep increasing our debt ceiling with zero consequences whatsoever. go to aid. We tell you, and they don't contest this, that voting for them definitionally means we cut the budgets, and we cut the budgets, we cut foreign aid. The only response is the application of our overview, which I just responded to earlier. The reason we need aid is it helps the global poor. As CF explains, our aid helps 1.3 million people every single month. You can vote right now because we're the only team that gives you a clear impact in this round. Voting for us, voting for the negative, saves 1.3 billion people each month. But let's go to the reasons why aid outweighs their arguments about recessions. So first we say the global poor come first. They basically concede to this because they go for the same impacts anyway. But then we say first, from Arias that says that recessions don't really impact developing countries because the trade is relatively insulated. They say U.S. investment decreases, but there's no U.S. investment in a global poor to begin with. Goldman Sachs is not going into Rwanda and Eritrea. That's ridiculous. There's no investment to decrease to begin with. But Gold also explains that our aid does not fluctuate during times of recession, meaning aid stays constant unless you vote for them and cut the budgets. Aid comes first for two reasons. First, they concede that the existence of recession stays the same. What matters is decreasing the severity of recessions. The Washington Post explains aid helps the most vulnerable during recessions and lifted 31 million people out of poverty. And second, aid is more targeted than general economic policies because aid specifically helps the people at the bottom. Economic policies just help everybody, not necessarily the people at the bottom who need it the most. Only aid does that.
We're going to run some prep time.
Let's talk about this idea where you say that Goldman Sachs doesn't go into Eritrea.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why people actually do invest in developing countries, right? So let's see if I see an opportunity that there are countries that are developing right now and will soon be emerging markets, and if I invest in there, does that mean in the long term I will have a better hold on that economy?
So the countries that are growing right now and developing are countries like India and China and other those countries. They're not
I would say Africa is growing.
So they're not necessarily the same
growing
countries that have the global poor. That's an important distinction.
Yeah, so there's two parts to this. The first is that investment doesn't go to countries that are super poor. They go to countries that are showing growth potential, that are going to become wealthy countries.
That's not necessarily true.
That is true, otherwise you wouldn't invest in those countries.
Are you saying that there's absolutely no investment in lesser developed
I'm saying there's very little investment in lesser developed economies. The second issue here is that even if investment goes into those lesser developed economies, it doesn't go to where the global poor are. Because you're not investing in subsistence farming where the global poor are. You're investing in wealthier cities. So either way, investment doesn't reach the global poor. Even if it reaches the countries they are in, it doesn't reach the global poor.
I would say that investment generally in the private sector tends to affect the global poor, right? Because we tell you that.
Alright, when does that happen?
What?
When does that happen?
In every recession?
Alright, so no, it hasn't.
Are you saying
in
that
2008, 64 million people across the entire world, including developing countries, were pushed into poverty. Why did that happen if apparently recessions don't impact people in developing countries? Right? It's kind of historically false.
You're saying it hurts them less than you make it out to be, and the fact that evidence is not evidence for you because you admit that the existence of recession stays the same. It's about
no, we do not. We do not admit that. Our financial transaction tax links into the frequency of recession.
No, you didn't extend speculation in some way.
He explicitly said financial transaction tax decreases speculation.
Our entire strategy is essentially that we impact recessions by one, decreasing the frequency of them and decreasing the severity of them.
Yeah, those are the two links that we extend, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about your idea that investment helps the global poor.
Yeah.
So let's say you're a subsistence farmer in a country, and I don't know, Nike builds a factory in a city 10 miles from where you live, 100 miles from where you live. Does that help your poverty?
I would say that maybe they built it in a city where I do live, and then I go, or I just move to that city and I go work in that factory, and they pay me better wages because they can afford to do so. So I would say, yeah, probably it does help me. Right? I would rather work for Nike than be a subsistence farmer, right? I feel like that'd be the same logic as most people in these countries.
Very simply, you can't just pack up and move to the city
I mean,
Second of all,
if you're telling me that they're barely surviving doing what they're doing, I would say that they would probably pack up and move and try to find a better job.
You need capital to pack up and move. It's not magic. You can't just be in a city.
Well, at best, would you agree that this is mitigatory?
Yeah, I suppose.
Sure. We'll take the rest of our program. So, it's going to be their observation, FTT stimuli 8. Everyone ready? Let's start on their observation. Ethan makes a really bad mistake in summary where he doesn't respond to our analysis about political consequences. The reason why we don't just borrow forever is because if one party decides to borrow forever, they'll get called out by the other party for being fiscally irresponsible. This means they will have no interest in doing this because they will get voted out. This is conceded in the round. Thus, they clearly don't win their overview. We can't borrow forever. We won't borrow forever. Thus, we are going to be winning our case. But now, let's go to the financial transaction tax. We tell you this is the most likely way to prioritizing reducing the debt. That's because it is bipartisan support, it's really popular. Their only response that they extend through Inc. is that it doesn't increase revenue. But what Jeremy tells you in summary is that investors will still invest because they are going to make a profit either way. If they make $1 million, or if they make $0.9 million, it really doesn't matter that much. They're still making a lot of money. They're still going to invest. That's why we tell you that it's going to increase revenue $400 billion. And Schenkman says that this tax would decrease speculation. Speculation is the root cause of economic crises. Thus, we do link into the frequency of recessions. Then, on the financial transaction tax, they extend 0 responses to this in this round. It's the cleanest place for you to vote. It is the most likely way. We tell you that the debt is unsustainable right now and that interest payments will amount to half of the government's revenue over the next decade. And Giorducci says that these interest payments limit the amount we can spend on fiscal stimuli, and fiscal stimuli are the best way we recover from recessions. And Friedman says that this U.S. recession does go global because it drops imports and decreases investment, and it destroys global economy. That's why the World Bank finds. In 2008, it drove 64 million people across the world into poverty. But now let's go to their case. Because we win our case, we win theirs. Because of the to-know evidence that we read that tells you that in the near future, the interest payments are going to make up 50% of the entire government's revenue. That means you're going to lead to long-term cuts, and those long-term cuts are going to decrease foreign aid. Now let's go to their way. We also link into the developing world. They just tell you recessions don't impact the global poor because the demand is inelastic. But we tell you, Jeremy gives us analysis and summary, that over time, countries sell more industrial goods. That means over time, they're going to be more dependent on the U.S. Over time, recessions hurt them a lot more. Thus, we are going to outlay on time frame. Thus, prefer.
Alright, we will run the last, what did I say? 1 point.
It's because he horizontal.
Is everyone ready? It's going to start really quickly on the third sheet of paper. I know. All right, start on the FTT stuff. Ethan explains that the FTT doesn't raise any revenue. They explain why the FTT should raise revenue. We give you warnings as to why it doesn't, that some investors still pull out, even if comparatively the profit is the same. Prefer our analysis because we actually have an analysis that says that it won't increase revenue. That is implicated in two ways. A, it means that this is not the implementation of the resolution, but B, it means even if it was, we still have to cut spending. Go to our observation about how we can keep borrowing. They say there's political consequences. The way here, though, is very simple. The political consequences are worse if you don't borrow and let the impacts they're talking about happen. We also already explained, and they conceded in case, that there are no political consequences to increasing the debt. They literally said Congress is entirely fiscally irresponsible and political consequences won't work. So yeah, we're going to keep borrowing. That's important because that means that the only scenario where budget cuts happen is in their world, and that's where foreign aid gets cut. We win foreign aid very clearly because they concede all the links and the impacts, which are that we save 1.3 million people every single month from food aid alone. Here's the weighing over recessions. The first is the clarity of impact weighing. Very simply, we are the only team that is providing you a number of lives you save, any quantification at all in the round. Second of all, is because we explain that aid is more targeted than the economic growth policies they're talking about. Even when recessions happen, the global poor themselves are relatively insulated from the recession, which is why they recover much, much faster than the developing world. It only took them 1 year to achieve growth rates of 50% in the last recession. And we say that means that the recession had less impact on the global poor than aid does. Because aid is more targeted, it's the only thing that goes directly to the global poor and is the only thing that actually improves their livelihoods. Thirdly, we explain that there is little investment in the global poor in the first place. Even if it's going to the countries where the global poor are, it is not going to the places where the global poor are, which means that recessions do not impact the global poor nearly as much as the aid does, which literally gives them the food they need to survive. Voting for them guarantees budget cuts. Even if you buy everything they're saying, you can vote for us off probability and clarity of impact.
This one has to